It's time to eat.
What are you hungry for?
Sit down and get ready to consume an abundance of fantasy football knowledge from Ross Tucker and John Daigle.
Feed me now. I'm starving.
On the Fantasy Feast Eatin' podcast.
Yeah, let's eat, baby. It is the Fantasy Feast Eatin' podcast. We are, of course, presented by DraftKings. DraftKings, the crown is yours. I'm Ross Tucker, former NFL offensive lineman, 5 teams, 7 years. You guys know that. Although, you know what? We always get new listeners. We get a bunch of new people watching youtube.com/Ross Tucker NFL or on the DraftKings network. Love getting the new viewers. Love getting the new listeners. Love this show because we are all over it from a prop betting standpoint and a fantasy football implication standpoint. If you're into fantasy football, you know it's like a year-round thing. And free agency, I guess the official kickoff of free agency, is exactly a week from when we are recording this. But things are happening. Reporters are saying, look for these guys to get paid more money than they otherwise would. You know, we've got trades going down. We've got guys being franchise tagged. So today is essentially, I don't know, I'll ask John. It's his deal. It's the top 10 questions heading into free agency presented by my guy, John Daigle, at NotJDaigle on social media. He is from EstablishTheRun.com, which has established themselves as probably being the premier place for fantasy football, prop betting information. Highly encourage you guys to sign up there. Just make sure when you do, you use the code FEAST so you get a discount. Like, you know, you're listening to the show, you might as well, if you're going to get the information, get the discount. I'm at Ross Tucker NFL on social. We're at Ross Tucker Pod. That's the greatest place for you to know when the show is posted immediately and to just see the 3 or 4 best highlight clips from every show. So, all right, John, you kind of came up with the format. I kind of love it. I love organization. I love lists. Everybody loves lists. Why do we love lists so much? I don't know, but we do. What was the thought process behind this?
Yes, there are a lot of players that we could discuss on this episode, but in a tight edition, we just want to touch on the most important questions and fallouts regarding fantasy players. So I think this is the top 10 questions for fantasy ahead of the chaos that's going to happen next week.
Yeah. And it's always interesting to see how many of these deals start to leak out coming up later this week, over the weekend, and then Monday and Tuesday. Forget about it during the legal tampering period, whatever that means, legal negotiating period. All right, let's start with your number one question. Deebo Samuel fallout, and really this relates to 2 teams. This relates to the San Francisco 49ers, and it relates to the Washington Commanders. What do you got for me, John?
And the question is, what else will Washington do in free agency to build around Jaden Daniels during this rookie contract window? Before we talk about that, though, I do want to start with the 49ers side of the ball because there are people that are going to establish the run using the promo code FEAST and seeing our best ball rankings for DraftKings right now. And so they are curious what happens to the 49ers players without Deebo Samuel. And I think there are 3 winners, and in order, I will go Ricky Pearsall, number 3 overall, because we saw in the last 2 games last year without both Deebo Samuel and Brandon Ayuk. Recall, Brandon Ayuk is recovering from November's torn ACL. Pearsall quietly posted 8 catches for 141 yards and a touchdown and 6 catches for 69 yards and a touchdown. Now, without both Ayuk and Samuel to start the year, Pearsall will be starting in 2 wide receiver sets alongside my number 2 beneficiary, Juwan Jennings, who we also saw last season without Deebo Samuel on the field, an absurd 41% target share. Really emerged as a true wide receiver 1, I would say, out of nowhere. We talked in our past shows how that threshold for elite wide receivers, Amon-Ra St. Brown, CeeDee Lamb, Justin Jefferson, is over 30% target share. And again, Jennings, without Deebo last year, 41%. Insane. But I believe the biggest beneficiary for fantasy without Deebo Samuel next year is going to be George Kittle. Fresh off of an overall tight end one season for fantasy, but more importantly, a 33% target share and 14 fantasy points per game in the 4 full starts he made from Brock Purdy and without Deebo the last 2 seasons. Right now, Brock Bowers and Trey McBride are the tight end 1 and 2 overall. I totally understand Sam Laporta is being argued right there next to George Kittle, but I do think George Kittle is currently a steal at his current 52 ADP on DraftKings. Now, I want to shift to Washington because the question is, what else will they do and what will Deebo Samuel bring? For starters, I do want to be ahead of a bounce back for Deebo Samuel in fantasy because he's coming off a career worst 8.5 yards per touch. But remember, the year prior, 11.5 yards per touch. Well, still the same old Deebo Samuel. It just happened that in his age 28 season, yes, he dealt with pneumonia, but also the pendulum swung in favor of Brandon Ayuk leading the team in targets at time, Juwan Jennings battling for targets, whereas in Washington, there's only Terry McLaurin. Like, for as much respect as I have for Diami Brown and Olamide Zaccheaus, what they did at the end of the season, there was no competition like Deebo Samuel for the wide receiver 2 role. Plus, Deebo earns his targets where Terry McLaurin does not. And so it gives Washington an entirely different element to add to their offense under Daniels. So I love the trade, a 5th-round pick for Deebo, and think he can bounce back as a confident 4th, 5th-round selection in fantasy this year.
Love it, love it, love it. I love the move too. It's not a great free agent class of receivers or draft for receivers. So for the Commanders to get a guy like Deebo, he has admitted on social media, John, that he was overweight last year and that's not going to be the same this year. He seemed like a guy very motivated to have a bounce back year. I don't know if he'll get back to like 21 Deebo, but I think he'll be worth the trade.
And I want to add that Washington probably isn't done to answer the real question here. They have been rumored to select, although they could go in favor of Dan Quinn, a defensive-minded head coach, and go that side of the ball at the back end of the first round. They have been rumored already to be looking at running backs to add more speed elements to their offense, and that includes North Carolina's Amari Hampton, 2,000 yards from scrimmage, by the way, in his final year at North Carolina, and then Virginia Tech's Bajal Tootin, who at 206 pounds ran a 4.32 40 as the most athletic running back at this year's combine. So I do not believe Washington is done just yet.
Love it. All right. Question number 2. Will T. Higgins take his first snap with the Bengals in 2025?
What's great for fantasy is that for the first time in his career, T. Higgins showed he can actually match Jamar Chase in points for points whenever the two play together. He was Cincinnati's 1B rather than their wide receiver 2, earning 8.5 targets per game and 18.5 fantasy points per game as the wide receiver 7 and the 12 starts he made alongside Jamar Chase. But as you know, Ross, and how long you've been covering this league, Bengals owner Mike Brown is also arguably the cheapest owner in the league. So although Higgins received the franchise tag, the real question is, after the organization perhaps resets the market with Jamar Chase, we don't even know if they're going to splurge that money just yet, although that's reportedly been their priority, then will they, 1, make room for T. Higgins, or 2, will he push his way out of Cincinnati in a sign and trade, tag and trade deal before week 1?
You know, I'm fascinated by the Bengals thing. I don't see them trading him. Mm-hmm. They're a conservative team. That's like an aggressive move. And I don't think that they want to send the message to Burrow and the rest of the team if they do that with Higgins, if they trade him. It could happen, but that would surprise me. I do not see that happening. What about Sam Darnold and what you think happens there? You know, I'm a little surprised, John. We've only heard the conversation with him still talking with the Vikings. Haven't heard a whole lot about other potential suitors for him or where else he might go.
Sam Darnold obviously coming off career highs across the board, including a 6.4% touchdown rate when his career average was 4.2%. And those numbers typically regress. We also saw from Sam Darnold's career year, Justin Jefferson sink to 4-year lows in points per game for fantasy. And that's still good for Justin Jefferson, who finished as the wide receiver 4 in points per game. But I think what happened for Jefferson, because he still had an amazing season, was really that he was battling the sophomore development of Jordan Addison, who also had career highs across the board. And now we've seen through 2 seasons and 33 career games, Addison has 19 touchdowns in that span. He's really growing into the exact prospect we thought he was, a stud wide receiver 2 right behind, if not alongside Jefferson. The question is, how much more production is there to leak out of a 28-year-old Sam Darnold? Because we saw him still become Darnold in those last 2 most important games of the regular season. Is this something that can grow further if he were to go back to Minnesota? Or will another team swoop in and use him as a bridge to another rookie? I think the Raiders are in play, and we'll talk about the Raiders in a bit. But right now, it does seem like the priority for Minnesota is to pad at least one more year for J.J. McCarthy to recover and develop and work out a similar deal to what the Seahawks initially worked out a couple years ago with Geno Smith, and basically sign Darnold for 1 year, if not a player option in year 2.
Huge fan of Smirnoff. Getting ready for this weekend. Couple of vodka Gatorades, vodka Pedialyte, hydrate while I'm getting my vodka on. Big fan of the fact that it is $12.99. Are you kidding me? Why spend so much on more expensive vodka? That makes no sense. There's a reason why Smirnoff's the world's #1 vodka. You can get it without breaking the bank. It's called being Smirnoff extraordinary. Please drink responsibly. Smirnoff number 21 vodka, distilled from grain, 40% alcohol by volume. The Smirnoff Company, New York, New York. Pricing is at the sole discretion of the retailer, may vary by state. Please not share with anyone under legal drinking age. Smirnoff, we do game days. And Thursday night and Friday night and Saturday night, potentially too. Very, very interesting. I didn't realize that impact on Jefferson. What about the Giants' Week 1 starting quarterback? Could that be Sam Darnold?
It could be, and there are a lot of options up in the air. Obviously, they've been rumored to try and trade up to number 1 overall with the Titans, who I still believe will move their pick for a big package that will include a quarterback. Cam Ward would be my selection here. But if the Giants stay at number 3, everything's on the board. Cam Ward, Shadur Sanders out of Colorado, Jackson Dart, who had a good Senior Bowl, Tyler Shaw is being predicted in the first round out of Louisville. So there are a lot of options here. And what we saw for fantasy was that Malik Neighbors was still an all-world rookie, regardless of who was under center. Neighbors was one of only 2 players with 170 targets last year, including Jamar Chase, and finishes the wide receiver 8 in points per game, despite playing with Daniel Jones, Drew Lock, and Tommy DeVito. So I have no idea how and who with the Giants will reset themselves under center with. We maybe even see Aaron Rodgers sign there as a bridge and bring along Devontae Adams too, and the Giants still draft a rookie to play behind Rodgers for a single year. But right now, I'm curious your thoughts because everything is up in the air.
Yeah, there's a lot of talk about them moving up to 1.
Yeah.
To get Cam Ward. What I'm hearing now is it seems like both the Browns and the Giants might really like Cam Ward, especially for the Giants, now that they were not able to get Matthew Stafford. So do the Giants leap over the Browns to get him? Do the Browns move up a spot, in order to do it? The thing is I feel like on some level, John, this will declare itself a little bit as we move forward because depending on what they do in free agency, we'll have a better idea of who might be looking to trade. In fact, they might even trade up to 1 shortly before free agency to know they can get the guy they want. I wouldn't be shocked if Cleveland or the Giants trade up to 1 soon so that they don't have to worry about getting a veteran guy or a bridge guy. Speaking of that, what do you think is Cleveland's direction as an organization right now?
It's a tough one as well because, as you said, I do expect either the Giants or the Browns to trade up to number one. I do not think Abdul Carter right now is the number one overall pick, especially battling the injury. Plus, we know quarterback remains the most important position of all of football. Teams will jostle for a player like Cam Ward, especially as Shadur Sanders, rumors has it, his interviews have completely tanked over Combine weekend. So it seems like Cam Ward has separated himself immensely in a tier of his own at the top of the draft. But Cleveland's direction ahead of free agency is very tough. 31st in available cap space, and that's due to their hands being tied with $145 million guaranteed to Deshaun Watson, 25% of their cap space over the next 2 years. Not only that, but they most likely don't have an elite pass rusher anymore either, as Myles Garrett has not only requested a trade, but refused to sign an extension. So if Cleveland were to stay at 2, does a player like Abdul Carter or Travis Hunter, although I believe they are difference makers, but do they actually help reset an organization who legitimately do not have a single answer at quarterback right now? I'm not sure, honestly. It seems like Cleveland is just kind of twirling in the wind. So curious on your thoughts on what you think Cleveland will do and what can help them start anew.
Well, so they're one of the more interesting teams, right? Both the Giants and the Browns, you would think that the GM and the head coach are on the hot seat. Certainly that's the case in New York. You know, maybe the Browns have more patience than they used to. This is always where you get into a really bad spot with certain ownership, because if you're the brain trust for the Giants or the Browns, you're probably making short-term decisions and potentially short-sighted decisions as a result. I know what I would do if I were Cleveland. I would have faith in Kevin Stefanski, and I would sign a guy like Daniel Jones and then take whichever quarterback I like the most in round 2 or 3. And with the number 2 overall pick, I would take Abdul Carter or Travis Hunter. You know, they need to win this year. That's the best recipe. We saw what Stefanski did with Joe Flacco. I actually think Daniel Jones is the type of guy that in the right situation could have a Sam Darnold or Baker Mayfield type of resurgence in a new place. Wouldn't be surprised if that place would be Cleveland. That's what I would do, and then take a Jackson Dart or, you know, somebody else later to kind of backfill it. What about a team that has their quarterback, John? That's the New England Patriots, over $100 million in cap space.
Only team with 100 million, they're at 120 plus million. All the room in the world to add pieces. But what are their priorities? And I would think that we both agree it has to be offensive line this year. They were also the only team to allow a 40% pressure rate last year, dead last in allowing pass rushers to reach both Drake May and Jacoby Brissett. But May still flashed and showed us what he can do despite constantly being under duress. In terms for fantasy only, even though everything else popped on film as well, the QB 15 and the 10 full games he played, including 4.9 carries and 4.2 rushing points per game tacked on with his legs. Drake May showed us he has it. And now the priority should be 1, offensive line, and then 2, getting some more playmakers in to help him grow.
As if I didn't love my dudes over at Labatt enough already, now they got this buy beer, get gear deal. You just head to the website, snap a photo of your receipt, upload it instantly to rack up points for exclusive merch. Unbelievable stuff, by the way, that you can check out at rewards.labattusa.com. You get points for every purchase anywhere, any size, no matter what. Just take a picture of the receipt, go to rewards.labattusa.com to sign up. Buy beer, get gear. Yeah, I'm a little surprised just as we're talking, and there have been some moves that the Bears have made for Jonah Jackson and Joe Thuney. A little surprised that the Patriots wouldn't get involved in either one of those. I think maybe they feel good about their guards. They're more worried about the tackles at this point, and so they didn't want to trade a pick and pay 16 or 17 million dollars for a guard with where they are kind of in their rebuild. But that would have been funny if Tooney went back to New England yet again. What about the Bucs? You know, especially with T. Higgins being tagged, John, Chris Godwin, even coming off the serious injury, is thought to be free agent wide receiver number one for teams.
And free agent wide receiver one for our purposes as well, because he was very good last year. As we've talked about in the past, Baker Mayfield posted career highs. In those first 7 games that Chris Godwin played, he was the wide receiver 2 in points per game behind Jamar Chase, and had 19 more targets than Mike Evans in the 7 games they played together. Showed that, like T. Higgins, he can be the team's leading wide receiver, despite how great Evans still was last year. Yes, he's going to be recovering from an injury the first month. It may be a slow start, but I would think even teams like the Patriots are definitely in on him if he were to leave Tampa Bay. Now, my belief is in not tagging him, that means the Bucs probably are close to having a monster deal waiting for him. But I believe he's absolutely worth the lucrative extension he's going to receive.
Ooh, and that's interesting that you think he's going to stay in Tampa. You got to think Baker wants that, especially with Mike Evans getting up there in years. It's kind of been what's made that team go, right? Baker throwing it to those 2 guys. What about AFC East? Let's talk a little bit about the Jets and the Dolphins, both of whom have glaring needs.
And typically for quarterbacks and finding the next guy for organizations, we discuss the connections they have. But in terms of free agency, what's happening, both Aaron Glenn, head coach of the Jets, and new OC Tanner Engstrand, who came from Detroit with Aaron Glenn, they really don't have many ties. Like, you'd have to go as deep as trading for Hendon Hooker if you were to find their next quarterback based on relationships alone. And I can't imagine the Jets roll out Hendon Hooker in week 1. So I genuinely have no clue what this team's plans to do outside of perhaps a trade up or starting an undeveloped rookie very early on. Maybe they try to make moves, for instance, like Derek Carr. Aaron Glenn does have some connections with him going back to New Orleans. But overall, I'm curious what the Jets do, because I genuinely don't have any idea what the direction is right now, except for Glenn definitely changing the culture from last year.
Yeah, that's obviously a priority. What about the Dolphins with their O-line?
And that's the answer, right? They know they have to upgrade their offensive line immensely, so much so that Tua last year averaged a career low depth of target, threw significantly closer to the line of scrimmage than ever before, because the Dolphins' offensive line cratered what they had planned to do prior to that, and they need to change that. We also saw that last year, although it helped Devon Achane, it's also what limited their offense as a whole. Last year, when Tua played, they were, from week 8 on, 8th in EPA per play. But without Tua on the field, dead last in EPA per play. It's still amazing that Mike McDaniel, for the offensive genius that he is, when Tua is not on the field, really struggles to score any amount of points and any amount of touchdowns. Something has to change there. And I think regardless of who they bring in as a backup, upgrading that offensive line will definitely help that case out for the instances when Tua is not available.
What about the Raiders' options at quarterback, John?
It's another question like the Jets in that your guess is as good as mine. Except, unlike the Jets, where we don't have any connections here, the Raiders have attempted to bring in different quarterbacks, and they've swung and missed immensely so far under the first year of Tom Brady helping out and being the de facto GM. Right now, it seems like they're left with only veteran options unless they do want to add a rookie and start him undeveloped in week 1. But I would think both Aaron Rodgers and Russell Wilson reconnecting with Pete Carroll are the options here. I don't know what that means for their ceiling, honestly, in year 1 under Carroll and Chip Kelly. But right now, I think that's the fallback. And it's weird because we all assume, and correctly assume, that Davante Adams will follow Aaron Rodgers in free agency. But at the same time, it's the organization, not the same regime, but the organization that also just traded Davante Adams after he had a hamstring injury, quote unquote hamstring injury, until he went to the Jets. So I'm curious to see what happens with this situation.
Yeah, I think he's going to end up with either the Rams or the Chargers. I think he's going to be in L.A. I think he wants to be out in the West Coast. They're both playoff teams. I see that. Lastly, what about the Texans? Let's talk Houston Texans. You think they bring Diggs back? What do you think?
That's a big question, too, because remember, last year, whenever Nico Collins and Tank Dell were at full strength, Tank Dell, who we not expect to open the year following his serious injury last regular season in the first month, but they had both those receivers at full health and then still went out and made a giant splash and trading for another strong wide receiver in Stephon Diggs. So I would imagine Nick Cesario's priority is to continue to add around CJ Stroud and his rookie contract and not being done yet. That includes adding offensive players in free agency, maybe since they saw a veteran receiver like Stephon Diggs and say, we can add his possessional threat in the slot. Maybe they look at Keenan Allen and say he brings the same thing that we thought Stephon Diggs would bring. But either way, one, I definitely do not think the Texans are done adding wide receivers in particular. And two, we at least saw that in 11 full games without Stephon Diggs available last year, Nico Collins was the wide receiver 9 in fantasy points and had a 37% target share. Nico Collins is still very much the wide receiver 1 for this team, regardless of who they add around him.
We will be all over the initial big moves of free agency 1 week from today. Then after that, we'll actually go through by position: quarterback, running back, tight end, wide receiver, with where these free agents landed, so you know exactly where to have these guys pegged for your fantasy drafts next year. Check him out. He's at Not J Daigle. I'm at Ross Tucker NFL. I'm stuffed. We're done.
Thanks for tuning in to Fantasy Feast. Make sure to also check out the Ross Tucker Football Podcast, Even Money, and College Draft, all on the DraftKings Network, YouTube, or subscribe to the podcasts on your favorite platform.